Hey, deserved listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Darcy and Stacy. JD says, I think Darcy suppresses any questions she has about her partners to keep the fantasy going, but then it, mixed with alcohol and inquisitive friends, explodes and she becomes judge, jury, and executioner. Right. I think that's a good observation. I think I've had that same hypothesis. Anna says, there's a long comment here. I discovered Dr. Honda when I was in lockdown in Barcelona. All I did was work, meditate, and binge watch 90 Day Fiancé. When I found Dr. Honda's reaction videos, it made me feel better about watching the show. But I never thought I would learn so much about myself. So when I met a man on Bumble, I shared it with him, and it was one of the things that we really bonded over. We fell in love, even though we had never even met in person. I was in Barcelona and he was in New York. We probably went against everything that Kirk would have recommended, and we went all in, even if we didn't really know each other. After one failed attempt of him trying to come to Barcelona, we met in Gibraltar and got married 6 weeks after we met on Bumble and 2 weeks after we met in person. We are now living in our dream home in Lisbon, and next week is our 1-year anniversary. And I feel like Dr. Honda is highly responsible for my marriage and for it being as healthy as it is. Thank you. Ah, well, Anna, that's a wonderful story. It's very romantic. You should make a movie about this story. It sounds really great. And happy anniversary. And, you know, you must be doing a lot of things right because, you know, you say your relationship is very healthy. So good for you. Laura says, when Darcy and Georgie... when Darcy asks Georgie if he's happy after his rather tedious conversation, we see Georgie smoking, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses and not speaking. His silence says it all. With Darcy, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's a no-win situation. There's nothing he can say that will be the right thing. Right. So with Darcy, because of her traumas, I think she has a lot of paranoia. My dog is barking. About being abandoned or about being criticized or rejected or something. And so she does vacillate between those two places of suppressing everything. And then when something comes up, then it all comes out and, you know, she'll just look for the tiniest little thing to focus on as this must be a reason why, you know, this is, you're hyper vigilant, right? You're like, this is the beginning of the end of the relationship. And so I need to come down hard on it. And then Georgie learns that he can't really win. There's nothing he can say that will soothe that because Darcy needs to go to therapy. And so he is now shutting down, which isn't a good sign. And I also think that Georgie suffers a little bit from the fact that he's not incredibly verbal. He doesn't talk a lot, either because it's just his personality or he learned he had to be a little defended, or he might be worried of saying things to Darcy and triggering her or something. But I think that we're beginning to see a pattern between the two of them that I'm a little worried about. And I hope the best for the two of them, and I hope that particularly Darcy gets her needs met, and I'm worried that she's going to sabotage it. Sarah says, I find Darcy frustrating. We see the same storyline play over and over with her. She has the benefit of being able to watch this show and play back and learn from it, but she does not. Therapy, therapy, therapy. Yeah, agreed. Listener Claire from Cleveland says, this was an email, actually, that someone sent in. They went to the Psychology in Seattle website and clicked on the contact button. I just wanted to comment on the fact that although U.S. culture is effed up about sex, do you think the kids reacted that way because they know they're being filmed and that it is cool for them as a teen to publicly express, discuss, hence reinforcing the idea in the U.S. that media, that yes, you should be disgusted when your parents talk to you about sex? Yeah, absolutely. It has become a trope in media for kids to be like, ew, it's gross that mom is talking about sex. And I mean, certainly that existed before when I was young, but not to the extent that it is now. Maybe American Pie was the cause of this. I don't know. But yeah, it's really frustrating to have this sort of trope happening. And, you know, when you're talking, you need to be guiding your kids in all sorts of ways. You need to be guiding them when they go to kindergarten. You need to guide them when they have their first crush. You need to guide them when they start driving a car. And you need to guide them about sexuality. Hopefully, you're not the only guide for them, but you are one of the guides. And the fact that we have this trope now that kids are supposed to be like, gross, and then parents are worried about that is extremely problematic. And as a result, when you neglect kids and you don't guide them, then you have all sorts of problems like shame and unwanted pregnancies and assaults and bad decision making and ignorance. And wouldn't it be nice if parents would guide? Now, we have a problem, though, because a lot of adults don't know much about sex themselves or are incredibly sex shaming and sex negative themselves. And so they have a hard time guiding anyone, let alone their own kids. And so the cycle continues, which is worrisome to me. Irina says, I think Georgie is from Bulgaria. It's very common in that part of the world to keep money in a sock rather than the bank. At least in Romania, banks didn't become more common until the late 90s, early 2000s, and we'd mostly use banks to get our salaries paid and pay certain bills at that point. Also, faith in banks and the banking system was non-existent back then, so it could be just a cultural thing, something he inherited from his parents. Right, absolutely. That gives context and makes total sense as to why he would put money in a sock. JR says, it was like watching a helicopter. Oh, so this is Stacy when she was hounding Florian about modeling. It was like watching a helicopter mom pushing her child. Lillian says, I think the pod wife seeing the bad modeling situation elicited the same reaction Dr. Honda would have if he saw a bad therapist session. Right. That's exactly true. That when I see a bad therapy session, the whole time I'm just like, oh, and the pod wife watching a bad modeling situation, yeah, she was quite upset about it. Jovi and Yara. Sylvia says, sounds like Jovi got left alone a lot when he was little. I say it because he sounds like he is asking his mom to pay attention to him. He doesn't sound like he's talking to his wife. Yeah, interesting hypothesis, Sylvia. That makes sense. I hadn't thought about that. That maybe he has an ongoing sense of being neglected due to his early childhood, and he is transferring that on to Yara. It's a perfectly possible hypothesis. Katie says, remember that Yara previously had a miscarriage, so I think she is extra paranoid about it now that she has a healthy baby. Absolutely. I had forgotten about that, Katie, but absolutely that could be a reason why Yara is sensitive to being separated from the baby. The other thing I'll say is that there is nothing odd about Yara's behavior. If anything, this is healthy behavior. If anything, this is what you want parents, both parents, to feel like, particularly in the beginning, when the child is so young and defenseless. So we don't need to make excuses for Yara. We do not need to do that. Mosif says, it was truly unreal for me to hear Jovi say he wanted time away from the baby when he'd already been away from her most of her life. Right, agreed. Now, why would Jovi be that way? I think that Jovi is still, for Yara, she's transitioned into motherhood much more smoothly. For Jovi, transitioning into fatherhood has been a more difficult thing for him. And he's been this way from the very beginning. He comes from a party background, and that's okay. There's going to be a transition time. We can trust that Jovi will transition eventually. And maybe he's going through a little bit of a bumpy time right now. So I think that if I were there talking to the two of them, that's how I would frame it. And I would say, okay, Jovi, how can you still retain some of that identity that you had in the past while also adjusting to the present? How can you do that without harming everyone? Because he could still do that. Maybe it's like once a week he hangs out with his friends or something, or whatever it is. Some kind of compromise there. Instead of what's happening is that I think he is just constantly pressing on Yara, and Yara is constantly resisting, and then they have the fights. Melee says, oh my God, my ex was mad at me when our son was a baby because all you care about is him. Needless to say, we didn't work out. Right. Yeah. When you have an infant child, all you care about is him. All you care about is the baby. That's the way it should be. Now, if you have one of the parents that's not totally into it, it's okay. But to criticize a parent for being 100% focused on a newborn is very strange. Brandon and Julia. Paulina says, Julie literally left her home country to be with Brandon, but Brandon's parents are like, be a little bit more understanding. Of course he doesn't want to leave the farm and move a mile away. Right. So the parents are saying, Julia, be a little bit more understanding. He doesn't want to move away from the farm. And Julia moved to another country. Yeah. Linda says, it's unfortunate that his parents aren't able to communicate to their son that they are proud of him and support his decision as he embarks on this new chapter of his life. It's almost as if the parents view him as an extension of themselves. Yeah, well, all parents do see their children as extensions of themselves, but I think that for Brandon and for Brandon's parents, they, due to their relational traumas, need to extend themselves into Brandon, I think. Elizabeth and Andre, just one comment here that I'll mention. Anya says, I would say that in Eastern Europe, we rarely sing happy birthday song or blow out candles. A cake is often considered just a dessert you eat at the end of a dinner. Right. So I was asking, because Andre started to cut into the birthday cake prior to the candles in the song. And for Jen, she's like, it's common sense. And I'm like, I don't think that's common sense. I think that is probably particular to the United States, or at least to certain countries. And maybe where Andre grew up, it's not the case. That would be my assumption. And he probably was just cutting the cake so that people could enjoy the cake. And he didn't know that you had to do it that way every time. And someone is saying that in Eastern Europe that, yeah, they don't necessarily do it that way. Mike and Natalie. So says, I think people often resort to you are manipulating me when something is uncomfortable or requires work. So I was talking about how on the show, and I think in real life, there's a lot of instances where people are in conflict and they're like, you're manipulating me. And I'm like, why do you think that? Like, it seems like a strange assumption. I dated someone who was very distant and avoidant, so I asked them to be more vulnerable. We had a wonderful moment together, but a day later they said I was manipulating them. Needless to say, we didn't work out. That's funny. So that's the second time someone has said, I think, is that the exact thing that someone said? Yeah, the exact sentence. Needless to say, we didn't work out. Maybe that could be a new trope, if you will, in the comments below. It's just like, you tell a story and then you're like, needless to say, it didn't work out. Maybe that could be a t-shirt. It's kind of dark, but I kind of like it. Anyway, Leah says, as someone who has been in couples therapy and is still with my husband, I will say I do think the mom factor, Mike's mom, is a legitimate issue because I always had a family member constantly talking badly about my partner. It would slowly eat away at us and it would be in the back of my mind. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think that the mom issue isn't as central as they're making it. I think they're triangulating it. But absolutely, I could see that if you had someone close to you, particularly the way Mike and his mom are close, always on the offensive against your partner, it absolutely could get into your head for sure. 295 says, on TikTok, there was a girl talking about how her and her partner will triangulate a made-up person named Scott and blame everything on Scott. I like that too. That's great. And when I was in middle school and early high school, my group of friends, there was one of our friends, I won't say his name, but we would blame everything on him. It was an inside joke that we started on a ski bus when we were going skiing. And then it just lasted for years and years and years. And whenever anything, and I think he actually got in trouble one time because a crime or a minor thing had happened at school, and someone said it was so and so, and then anyway. But yeah, Scott, just Scott. The name's Scott. Just blame it on Scott. And I'm trying to imagine how that goes. It's like you get into a fight, and then later on you're like, sorry about the fight, but if it wasn't for Scott, we wouldn't have even gotten the fight in the first place. I like that. Sirius says, the meat store, so I said the meat store instead of butcher. The meat store reminds me of It's Always Sunny, how they'll say welfare store or hamburger store. It makes me laugh. Now, every time I say blank store, LOL. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with my brain. I can't remember professions. I can't remember names for certain stores. I blame my parents because my parents are they're smart people, but they're not incredibly verbal, and they also don't have a large vocabulary. I didn't grow up in a house with a large vocabulary, let's just put it that way. And so I think that I take after my parents in that way. Along those lines, another problem that I have is with idioms, certain phrases, cliches that are said for the same reason my parents didn't say those kinds of things. And I think idioms are kind of something you pick up from literature, or I don't know. And I am terrible with idioms. Z says, good old Z says, when I was young and I got scolded, I just turned blank. If I cried, so this is reacting to when Natalie just seemed blank. When I was young and got scolded, I just learned to be blank. If I cried, it didn't go well. If I tried to explain myself, it didn't go well. So you just remain blank and hope it finishes quickly so you can go somewhere else and cry. Yeah, absolutely. I could see that that's what Natalie's going through. Devin and Jihoon. Moon says, it's actually really hard to get a full-time job in Seoul. All of my Korean friends have degrees and struggle so much to find a good job. The pay is often low, and many of my friends work 6 days a week. That's good context. I didn't know that. That's interesting. And would play into the problems between them. Andrea says, I think it's important to keep in mind that Korea has a pretty high unemployment rate now, and even really qualified people are struggling to find jobs. So I can imagine it's even harder for someone like Jihoon to get a good job, even if he does try. Agreed. Phalian says, I haven't watched the video yet, but I just want to let you know I'm now getting bidet advertisements on your videos. Oh, right. So, if I put in a previous, Jihoon video that I titled, I put bidet in there. And so the YouTube algorithm saw that you clicked on a video with bidet in the title, and it thinks you're looking for a bidet. And so now you're getting bidet advertisements on YouTube, which makes me wonder if I could just put in random words into my title and you would just get a bunch of weird advertisements like lawnmowers or something. I don't know. Anyway. Queen Oblivia says, I get strong ADHD vibes from Jihoon. He may actually have trouble functioning, which could be causing this negative self-image. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't talked about Jihoon and ADHD, and I don't think I will directly because it gets thrown around a lot. And it's absolutely possible that Jihoon has ADHD for sure, and it could explain pretty much all the complaints that Devin has about him, from his low self-esteem, because when you're growing up and you have ADHD, you're trying to function as everyone else is in class and at home, and you are being distracted, but you're having a hard time with working memory, and you end up making a lot of mistakes, and it's often perceived by authority that you're being lazy or doing it on purpose or you're not trying hard enough when the child really is trying hard. And so you internalize this image of yourself as you're a screw up, you're a loser, there's something deeply wrong with you. And Jihoon seems to exhibit that. The other parts of Jihoon is when he's given a task, he doesn't follow through with it unless it's right in front of his face. And this is a classic ADHD thing, is that when you tell someone with ADHD, hey, I need you to do this chore, and then you walk out of the room, the way that their brain works, it's hard for them to see all the steps through in their head. Plus, they have low self-esteem because they have screwed up a lot in their life. Plus, they're distractible by things that are happening right in front of their face. Whereas, if you're right in front of their face and you're like, hey, let's do the 5 steps of this chore. Do this right now. And they're like, oh, okay. And they want to do it, and if you help them and walk them through each step, then they can do it. But if you tell them to do it and walk away, it's harder for them to achieve it. And most of child tasks that you give to children are things that you tell them and walk away, like homework or something like this. And so Devin said, hey, find a place. There's different things that she would say, and then he would just drop the ball. And absolutely, ADHD could be part of it. But it's just hard to know. 2-Bit says, I feel like there's an interesting gendered aspect to how this personality disorder is depicted in the show and maybe even in society. It's a cliche in shows to see the husband as incompetent and the wife as hyper-competent. Dr. Honda, is there some data to suggest that this dependence is suffered more by men, or does it simply play into our sexist ideas of gender roles? Yeah, it's a good question, and it is a cliche, like it's the Simpsons cliche, where you have a Homer that is totally incompetent and bumbling and almost like a child, and then you have this super competent mother. It is a cultural cliche, but and you're asking it plays into certain ideas about gender. It plays into certain ideas that men are always essentially boys. Men are always essentially children on the inside, Like, boys will be boys and men will be men and men and their toys, whereas women aren't given that latitude because men want to have the freedom to be childish, whereas women aren't allowed to be that way. And a lot of time child responsibilities are foisted entirely on women, and so women can't afford to be a child, whereas men will be like, okay, I'm leaving for the weekend and I'm going to be a child with my buddies again. And so there's a lot that you could talk about in terms of sexism for sure. But you ask, is there data to suggest that men are inherently more like that? With Ji-hoon, he is this bumbling child boy, man boy. And this show, I will say that this, and I've talked, and maybe this is the reaction, the show has a lot of that. There's a lot of men who are failing in life, so to speak, and you have the woman saying, how come you're not working harder, a Suelu and this sort of thing. Is there data to suggest that this dependence is suffered more by men? No. I don't have the data in front of me, but this sort of personality trait is across all genders. It often gets portrayed with men. It also, when it's a woman who is dependent in this way, it's less noticeable because we expect men to have a job and to provide for a family. Whereas if a woman is like that, imagine if the roles were reversed and Devin was the man and Ji-hoon was the woman, and Devin was, the man, the white man from the United States was coming to Korea and saying, hey, you need to work. A lot of people would just say like, look, you're the man, you need to find work. And we do see this actually happen sometimes, with Mike and Natalie. Mike is often saying, hey, you need to work, but it has a different tone to it. And the reaction in the comment section will be different as well. Anyway, that's my answer to that question. Well, let me answer a little bit longer. Dependency in women is something that's a big problem. Dependent personality is a problem in any person. It can be very destructive to the individual particularly, but also to those around them. But when a woman has dependent personality, it's much more easily hidden. Did I make that clear? Anyway, Nikki says, I love shoju, even straight. Dr. Honda, you have to give it another try. You must just not have had a good kind of soju. Well, Nikki, that's possible. I've had a lot of shoju, and it's rough on me. There's a lot of alcohols that are just, I just cannot stand drinking them straight. So, but I've said that, I used to say that about like all sorts of alcohols, but then like with rum, I always just could not stand to, sip rum out of, with just ice. But then I went to Cuba, and I don't know if it was just the environment or something, and I've heard that the actual rum that's made in Cuba is a lot better. But since I went to Cuba, I was like, oh, actually, maybe rum can be sipped or something. So maybe I need to try out some good shoju. Yeah, and I'll be defensive sometimes about sake, from Japan, that people be like, oh, sake, it's so gross. And I'm like, oh, there's a wide variety of sake. Like you really have to, it's one of the most variable alcohols out there. There's a lot of variability. Anyway, Han Blonde says, Real Housewives video. Han Blonde says, I love what you said about jealousy being the scapegoat people jump to when they're in conflict. So Sutton and Crystal were in a fight, and one of them said, I think you're just jealous of me. And I was like, why do people do that? It's such a weird accusation. It seems that it's easier for our brains to decide someone is jealous than to pick apart the nuances of interpersonal conflict, thereby accepting some personal responsibility. I feel like it starts in kindergarten when someone picks on you and the go-to mom answer is they're just jealous. Because to your mom, you're the most amazing thing in the world and other kids are just little turds. Yeah, I kind of remember my mom doing that too. I remember, I don't remember her doing it a lot, but there's this one moment where I remember her saying that to me. I was complaining about a friend in the 6th grade, and my mom said, well, he's just probably jealous of you. And I remember being, huh, really? Like, he's jealous of me? Kania says, I think Sutton must like the attention on her. Yeah, so there was a number of comments about that, like, oh, Sutton is hysterical and, you know, acting all sad and stuff, and she likes the attention. I think it's possible, but my observation of Sutton is that she is easily triggered, which means that she has been traumatized a lot and has not healed from it. She seems legitimately physically impacted when these things are happening. And I think she's melting down, and I think it's legitimate. Might she like the attention? Sure, but I get the impression that if she could, so here's my impression of her, that before she goes to the party, she's like, I don't want to get into a fight. I'm just not going to get into a fight. But then there's another part of her that's just like, but what about what Crystal said? And there's another part that's like, no, I'm just going to be calm. Everything is going to be fine. And I'm just going to do nothing. Okay. But then she gets there and she starts to lose control of her emotions and she becomes fused and undifferentiated. And then people ask her, and we saw that in the video, that, like, was it Kyle just kept badgering her, and Sutton was just like, I just don't want to talk about it, you know, because I came here and I didn't want to fight. And then once the floodgates open, then all of the emotions start coming out. I think she legitimately is, I don't think she's faking any of it. I think it's real. You can have a problem with her, what she's saying, but I don't think she's faking it. Big Ed, Catherine says, I feel like Liz is acting agreeable because she is afraid of Ed's retaliation if she isn't saying what he wants to hear. Yeah, that could be. Stu says, I feel like Dr. Honda is more of a psychic than all of the psychics on 90 Day Fiancé combined. Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to take that, but I get what you're saying, I think. Anyway, that's the end of that. So tune in next time when I continue watching these shows, and tune in next week when I react to your comments again, and make sure you comment below. And be nice to each other in the comments. I want to have a nice community, respectful community, give people the benefit of the doubt because we deserve it. We really, really do.